Hello, thank you for the introduction. I hope you can see me and hear me well.
Yeah.
And with this paper, I wish to advance a certain understanding of Heidegger's work as a conceptual tool for a certain type of praxis. The main concept by which this new interpretative value becomes present is in the notion of circumlocution as an element of literary style and mindful practice or type of engagement with the world. By such a rereading of his work, the possibility of new understanding of Heidegger's aims emerges, pushing forward the idea of that thoughtful engagement with the world through literary style that almost simulates the wandering of inner thought will in fact provoke new forms of behavior and relation to being, a new aesthesis that goes beyond philosophical investigation and finds confine in considering the whole of Heidegger's work in terms of a project in radical will. Namely, if philosophy is considered as a practice of concept creation as posited by Deleuze and Guattari, and not that far from art, then we can go further and suggest that there are genuine drives inside philosophy for its overcoming, just as conceptualism in art brings the notion of art itself into question, and after which no art is no longer considered art proper. But conceptual art is engaging, and one of its major parts would be the performative action or certain artistic practice as a project of radical will. The convergence of art as well as philosophy with life through advances of modern techno-sciences brings about the need for a new mode of thought, as layering of reality has proven to be overwhelming and alienating for the everyday experience of life world itself. Circumlocution as method for a certain mindful praxis points to the central importance of going about or being present through one's language, finding confine within it, and bringing from within it the possibility of understanding phenomena. As such, circumlocution has a lot to do with vernacularism and Heidegger's philosophy, with the disclosing, spreading out, and bringing forth of a leveled ground for which language is not reducible to the figures of speech, but taken altogether as provoking and inspiring certain attitudes and engagement with the world. Premises for such conceptualization are the following. First, there is the general disposition of Heidegger's philosophy that is to an extent understood as radical overcoming of the Western philosophical tradition towards the certain realization of philosophy or destruction of metaphysics. From this comes second, the most radical inadequacy of contemporary language and culture to address not only contemporary phenomena, but also to fully explain and give meaning to fundamental problems of human experience. Heidegger's papers are engaged with rather contemporary themes, from fundamental concepts of time and being to more particular ones like image theory, physical science, technology, cybernetics, etc. And his use of philosophical references is commonly literary, just as his use of references from arts, and especially of his refuge in poetry. His critical relation with philosophy, understood in terms of destruction and realization, shows us just why, for example, being and time could be taken as a body of work explaining the phenomena of time as it arises in the human experience, and not a time as a phenomena of physical science or a property outside the human life itself, and applied to it in a sort of backwards way. His work thus paradoxically stressed the importance of immediate experience and fundamental phenomena that is radically obscured by the advances of physical science, which always presents itself as immediately obvious. Third premise of Heidegger's circumlocutive practice that stems from this is that it is providing us with new views and considerations of phenomenology as fundamental ontology or existential phenomenology in respect to some of his interpreters. This also must be taken in light of him dispensing with philosophy or metaphysics as such. He is concerned with life experience as evidenced in the age of the world picture, being the only age that is immediately available to us. He does not speculate on the past and does not forecast the future, and in that manner we can understand his philosophical practice as a form of radical presencing, or establishing itself in time as the present within the possibilities of language, and taught to express them as such. And for such a task, it should be obvious that he must take on the most radical of philosophies available to his time. In his own interpretation, however, phenomenology takes on a radically different form. This is because he takes on the concept of phenomenology at face value and makes sense out of it purely from the name itself. It is not a science proper, but a practice of making sense out of phenomena. And this making sense is done no longer through philosophy, but through literary means, or rather through philosophy taken as artistic, conceptual, and performative practice, not to say by taking it politically, but certainly understanding it no longer in philosophical terms, but rather in terms of action or acting out of certain disposition of thoughtful action. Heidegger's own motivation for entertaining such themes and adopting just such a style lies in the everyday life of the early 20th century and the developments surrounding the two world wars. It is the age of modern science and the techno-scientific augmentation of daily life on an unprecedented scale that reshaped the infrastructures of society as well as its culture, art, and language. Alas, it fundamentally changed its patterns of thought. What began as scientific theory of special relativity also marked the high point of, by that time rather present and actual, debate over the structure, meaning, and goals of physical theory. The now historic debate between Henri Bergson and Albert Einstein marked the final decline of philosophy as well as the advent of popular culture as popularization of science and culture as politics. This was exceptionally notable in Heidegger's text on the age of the world picture. Not to be forgotten is that French leader of radical thought in the 70s, Guy Debord, marks the advent of the spectacle in the same historic time, tracing it through the same historic events and explaining it through same sets of consequences. The debate didn't single-handedly, but rather symbolically mark the decline of modernist culture and the rise of postmodernism in the application of technoscience to the everyday life. Phenomena such as photography, film, and computation changed the sense of our concepts of time as continuation, image as inanimate and artificial, or memory as an integral part of human imagination. These are now all out in the open, subjected to operations in the age of man's ascension to the throne of this absolute technoscientific humanism. Our language comes to reflect that, but also our relationship with our language and its expressive value and effective power. New languages emerge and reality becomes layered, increasingly complex and alienating. It is Heidegger's own relation to philosophy and thought of his own time that must be thus central to understanding the aims and prescribe the uses of his philosophy for new conceptualization of just such a mode of being that would go beyond the stalemate of binary oppositions of thought and action, theory and practice. For this, Heidegger was well equipped, and his work in that respect found a productive refuge in non-European and non-Western traditions of thought, which may as well be older than ours, but still present themselves as fundamentally new in the prospects of Western philosophical project. By this reconceptualization, a new intellectual map of philosophy as praxis would emerge in the history of the 20th century, one that goes over Heidegger not only to dispense with philosophy, but with this Western socio-political and cultural decadence that is itself a product of philosophy finding its point of realization in modern technoscience. By the time of Heidegger's writing, the problems he sets himself to face are already addressed in the contemporary philosophy, from mentioned Bergson to Whitehead, as well as some other overlooked thinkers that fall outside philosophy proper, like Pierre Duhem's Structure of Physical Science. And at the time of his writing, philosophy itself becomes a subject taken on by most prominent physical scientists of his time, from Albert Einstein to Werner Heisenberg. Most recently, the multi-billionaires take the roles of scientists, taking the roles of philosophers, and speculate on the nature of reality itself, as we see in most recent discussions by Elon Musk over the simulation of our own reality. Philosophy itself thus becomes an alienating project, summed up in the quote of the above-mentioned Debord and his Society of the Spectacle, where he says, "The spectacle is the inheritor of the weaknesses of the Western philosophical project, which attempted to understand activity by means of the categories of vision, and it is based on the relentless development of the particular technical rationality that grew out of that form of thought. The spectacle does not realize philosophy, it philosophizes reality, reducing everyone's concrete life to speculative universe. I end quote. As we are concerned here with the motivations for reading Heidegger's work in the contemporary age that he himself described as the age of the world picture, the age of superficiality and technical frameworks, and in which any possibility for thought lies in overstepping the philosophy's end inside the social application of cybernetical science, we will only suggest that distinct qualities of Heidegger's writing is in its ability to provoke an authentic practical response or more meaningful interaction with the world, which would not be available to us if he adopted the philosophic or scientific style of writing. This means that my work here is on the fringes of aesthetic methodology, aesthetics of reception, the literary critique, but also a study in social, cultural, history, and philosophical context in the light of Heidegger's own reconceptualization of phenomenology as the study of the daily life in its essential properties, or nothing short of vernacularism, and as a cumulative effort in establishing a way of thought as well as the way for thought to preserve itself in the time of unprecedented intellectual crisis. In this respect, we must only consider Heidegger's style of writing as providing us with a method for thought. It is a sort of situationist project. Bringing about the Heideggerian way of thought leads only out of philosophy and into the observing world, not by means of spreading out of philosophy over immediate experience, but by making experience of the world immediately present in the wandering language of thought. One of the first and rather obvious direction of this analysis would be to point out this essential role vernacularism plays in Heidegger's philosophy. By his use of vernacular terms, Heidegger does not want to augment the language of philosophy, but rather to augment language itself with potentialities for thought-provoking wondering, but also marveling on the potentialities of the most mundane terms to gain significant intellectual traction if they are employed in a certain style which reflects in the correct manner the myriad ways it is able to make sense out of phenomena it is applied to. This is done by means of rethinking the relationship to language and the possibilities of its use, not limited to, I quote, only to means of expression, end quote. Our effort here is impressionist upon the reading of Being and Time, and especially his earlier text, the Prolegomena, for the history of the concept of time. In there, Heidegger discusses in length not only his considerations of phenomenology, but also his style. Analysis he provides us with in the Prolegomena are his most lengthy studies in the differences and the nuances of immediate perception, presencing its expression in language and symbols of culture, their connections and structures. However, this is not a theory of science pertaining to explain the concrete works of the mind, as Heidegger is well aware that the exact scientists will dominate in that respect, and psychology, neuroscience, and physics will strive towards the complete schematic of inner works of the human mind. He only proposes a structure that has the quality to bring about the wandering relation with our daily experience and to understand fully what and how we speak, why, and to what end do we express our experiences in language. This is why he is not reluctant to bring forth the methodic rules for certain structures of his work, such as intentionality, which is not good to be speculated about rather than being followed in its concreteness, as he says. I quote, "Phenomenology is a research exactly the work of unveiling and making it be seen in the sense of methodically guided disintegration of concealness. It does not want philosophy, it wants things." So as debating the structure of experience as the radical path of phenomenology inside philosophy, Heidegger wants to set this path free of the paving stones of philosophical and scientific truth, so as to bring forth the literary language as a method for experience or a way to live a life. This preparation itself, and throughout this lengthy and somewhat hermetic works, does not in fact have to represent any structure at all, but only a guided motivation for just such a mindful relation towards the world. This is why Heidegger's work is always presented by himself as a preparatory stage. It does not require of us to employ his methods and structures presented, but to take and find in them and inspiration from them, because it overcomes philosophy, so there is nothing left to take on except engagement in a form of practice. We already know Prolegomena, Being and Time deal with presencing, being there, and time in the light of contemporary debates and the implied prescribing of technoscientific notion of time to immediate human experience. Heidegger wants to do more by developing the idea of history of the concept of time as history of discovering time as the history of the essence of being. And this history should build up the question of being as certain phenomenology of presencing or being there, or as a philosophy of time which radically oversteps any further philosophical engagement, as it is at the same time the transcendental condition of the possibility of bringing being into question and the fringe of the possibility of its explanation or expression. Most importantly, it is here in the central part of the prolegomena that Heidegger himself warns us that in this explication of being, there we will stumble upon a vast number of formulations that have at first a peculiar character, and above all, in formulation, the character of hesitation, end quote. This is due, as he says, the nature of language, inadequacy of words and grammar itself. Being there must be discovered in the immediate daily presencing, in the facticity of that to be that is not reducible to any individual daily life, but the daily presencing of the everyday, in the daily presencing of any individual to be as being there. Now, Heidegger, in order to fully stand behind this, his more than often stressed inadequacy of language and its cultural phenomena to address the essential properties of experience of being in the world as presencing, as being there and as being human, or even intentioning oneself towards some action, must take on his own philosophy to a level that radically dispenses with any form of definitive or scientific statement. There are three methods to uphold this idea: the extensive preparatory work, which is the essential and proper to circumlocution or periphrasis in style, and digressions and transgressions in use of vernacular concepts. Heidegger's comment on the practice being derealized in the age of modern science bears importance in more than few aspects. He says in the age of the world picture, machine technology is itself an autonomous transformation of praxis, a type of transformation wherein praxis first demands the employment of mathematical physical science. Machine technology remains up to now the most visible outgrowth of the essence of modern technology, which is identical with the essence of modern metaphysics. We don't even have to mention that the connections to his other texts are here fairly obvious, as the essence of modern metaphysics or the overcoming of metaphysics is anticipated here in his text of The End of Philosophy and the Task of Thinking, and the essence of modern technology in the Enframing or the Gestalt. The same goes for the notion of the world picture in the text that tries to establish a grounding for bringing into view the essence of modern science. We are first invited into a brief discussion over the most appropriate path to lead us towards the essence of modern era, and this is established to be the way through the essence of science, where Heidegger now must convince us that the essence of science is equal to the essence of modern era, because the latter is dominated by the application of modern science to the life world of modern man. This is done through technosciences and its enframing, through which then the modern man has its world served to him as a standing in front picture, in essence of which lies a system. World as picture means exactly that, provoked by science, drawing out of the world from the confines of immediate experience to a standing in front, being a background or a forefront of action that is no longer integral to it, but only supplemental and complementary. And as the idiom worldview suggests in discussing the notion of the world picture, we are dealing with the dominant attitude towards the world. Heidegger's use of circling around, unfolding and stretching out a certain theme in its possible literary outlooks aims to provoke a certain understanding or a proper motivation for observing the concrete workings of modern science applied to daily life through categories which don't seem to be immediately connected to it. And not to go into deep depths of rereading and quoting various places of being and time, where Heidegger obviously plays on our immediate impressions of fundamental phenomena of experience, we are invited only to browse over the problematic of time and being there in the context of vernacularism and circumlocution. We already know that more than often Heidegger stresses the importance of grasping Dasein in its daily presencing as well as its surrounding world. The theme will stretch over the whole discussion in being and time, but the terms employed in the discussion will become increasingly enriched by the developing ecology or the conceptual landscape, which will actively act to suppress us from taking any of the notions lightly, and rather to act mindfully towards the understanding of the conceptual and practical implications of certain understanding of certain words and phrases, like the concepts of world or time. This is the essence of circumlocution, as it acts upon the philosophical and conceptual landscape in the manner as practices like psychogeography act upon the actual urban landscape of man-made environments. Language and culture are also to be taken as man-made environments in that respect. I will jump over one part here, and we will browse over the design thing, because I think it should be fairly obvious, and I will just skip to the comparison, because even though there are more than few indications that Guy Debord was well aware of Heidegger and has read his work, we are far from saying that there is any direct influence between them, but rather I would like to stress their conceptual closeness in what I would deem to be a certain line of contemporary thought with respect to indirect provocation of certain mindful attitudes towards everyday life. I would just trace a certain similarity in Debord's use of the term spectacle, which is widely misused and misinterpreted as an artifact of media theory. A lot of this is the blame of Debord himself, who was not standing firmly enough at explaining the importance or the correct translation of the term, which is only achievable through circumlocution, because his work on the theory of the spectacle is itself an effort at utilizing circumlocution as a method in exploring the nuances of the term that is very carefully selected and in no way reducible to the spectacle in English translation, but would rather have to employ numerous other terms like the show, visualization, observing, and etc. In that sense, his task is not dissimilar to that of Heidegger, who had effectively used up a large portion of being and time just to circumfuse a term like Dasein and bring it into the focus not as a reinvented term, but as a circumstance that reinvents the everyday life in which it appears. We must not overlook that Dasein is a commonly used term in the daily speech, as well as is the spectacle in the daily French language, and the effect on the reader of being and time or the society of the spectacle in their respective languages can have a genuine influence on their mindful action in the world, reshaped towards accommodating the circumlocution involved in leveling the field of meaning, which is crucial in critical address of contemporary phenomena such as virtual reality and AI technologies. This mindful and leveled experience of the world through wandering confined in language is something that brings into question one more striking properties of Heidegger's philosophy, which I saved for the end because it's often discussed and was discussed earlier today in other contexts in some other morning sessions, and it's his connection to the Japanese philosophy and its reception inside the Japanese thought. I will also skip over this, and because I think we already know some of those connections, I would like, in the same manner as I just mentioned Debord, mention the influence or the interplay of one Japanese term in the philosophy of Nishida. It's the term basho, that is more literally translatable as situation or situatedness or standing about, that comprises of two characters which have fundamentally the same meaning, location. It appears in his philosophy, which tries to overcome the classical philosophical dualisms in the radical attempt at philosophy of nothingness, or situating nothingness within the perspective opened up by reception of Western thought in emerging intellectual centers of Japan. But what is most important is that this term is also a common daily term in the Japanese language, and that Kyoto School is actually founded on this kind of literary expression, which is actually at home in Japanese language, which carries myriad meanings on the same level of expression and does very little at expressing a philosophical thought. In the end, I would conclude that phenomenology, in the light of Heidegger's project of mindful reaction against the movements and the advances of modern techno-science, is the philosophy, post-philosophy, for which circumlocution is the method. Throughout his work, Heidegger remained methodically sound as long as the method is understood in terms of style and provocative nature of his texts, bringing us into the realm of mindful engagement with the world. Heidegger's project of thought, as described here, belongs to a new conceptual map, which is developed on the idea of overcoming philosophy and its realization in the application of contemporary technoscience in the everyday life. This realization of philosophy is best described in the work of French intellectual Guy Debord in his critique of contemporary society through phenomena of the spectacle, with the understanding that the spectacle itself is the realization of Western philosophical project, which builds almost directly, even though not in any immediate sense, on Heidegger's age of the world picture and end of philosophy and task of thinking. A further point on this map is the philosophy developed through reception and permutation of Western thought in the Kyoto School as one of the most creative developments in recent reorganization of thought in light of fundamental social and intellectual crisis of our time. The reception of Western thought on the radically different cultural, spiritual, and linguistic ground still proves to be a challenging and provoking and engaging way to consider philosophy as praxis. What connects these three is the general disposition of their thought, which befalls on that which Whitehead described as immediate literary obviousness in writing, as well as specific style, as well as almost radical orientation towards the everyday experience, acting almost impressionist upon it and advocating the possible utilization of thought-provoking text in achieving a more immediate and more involved connection to the life world, exactly as life world and not only its image. Circumlocution is at the same time a literary style and the wandering practice of laying out the environment for a mindful engagement with the daily phenomena. It is the unfolding out of that what is already on everybody's mind, but is now presencing and serving as a method for certain practice of the everyday life in terms of being expressive life, in which our actions are our philosophy, and our actions are not reducible to act itself, but also include our intentions, attitudes, thoughts, and manners on the same level of action, which is the same as the level of thought. In that way, every text abiding this method is a permanent introduction and laying of a grounding for a situation through which we gain the ability to act in the world outside of conditions set up by technoscientific drives of optimization, reduction, and layering of reality. If philosophy reached its demise in contemporary world of technosciences, it would be only natural to consider another radical form of action to give thought a path into the new without losing its sense of wandering, marveling, and circumlocuting its own way into language, expression, and the world. Via circumlocution as method, we are in the openness of a certain praxis that remains philosophical by going beyond the confines of philosophy as a discipline and towards the genuine interest in knowledge understood as being mindful of the world. And in that sense, vernacularism is an anchoring or covering of two worlds into one whole as a unitary project for which circumlocution acts as a sort of geography, sketching out of a literary environment in and through which we grasp phenomena and engage them as social beings. And I would conclude here so we have some time for discussion, even though there is still a lot to be said about STEAM.
Thank you, colleague Dario. I find your lecture slightly different in terms of engaging several different disciplines in one piece, and I would ask our colleagues whether anybody has some question, comment, please. If not, okay, colleague Christian, please.
Thank you, Dario, for this inspiring discussion. I would link. Of course, you have already done the circumlocution to the idea of the circle, the circularity, and I was wondering if you would like to develop this idea that a style of thought linked to a geometrical figure. In the case of Heidegger, he says a lot of things about the circle, the hermeneutic circle. He said about you cannot avoid the so-called vicious circles, but what is important is to enter rightly in the circle, because you cannot avoid the circle. And if with Heidegger in this evasive way of thinking, this way of going from in circle, if you can move to other authors. Of course, we can have this figure of Le Flâneur, for example. If you can apply this figure for a style of thought, or maybe other geometrical figures, how could you describe in these terms, geometrical terms, the way of thinking of Levinas or of Husserl? They are more rectangular, or so. But in the case of Husserl, how can you expand this prism, which is interesting? But I think with a single case like Heidegger, it's easy to do it. But if you expand and take different cases and say, for example, Jean-Luc Marion, what kind of geometrical style of thought? This is a spiral. It's the pyramid. It's, of course, we have the peripatetic already in the ancient times, running around, going around, not staying in a single place. Or you have the ascensive Platonic, look up in the sky and so on. But in the framework of phenomenology, how would you expand this metaphor, let's say, of the circle as a style of thought, for other authors? Thanks.
Thank you. This is a really engaging question. It would be certainly interesting to trace the geometries of other people's of other thoughts, but in that respect, I actually browsed over some parts of my discussion where I tried to compare the three terms that I mentioned here, that were the Dasein, or this being there in Heidegger, and the spectacle in the Bohr, and the Basho in Kitaro Nishida's philosophy, in terms of trying to understand those terms as effectively empty vernacular terms around which one circles around, and I describe them as infinitesimally small, because they actually are not, at the same time, they are not reducible to the term itself, but they are in no way expandable beyond that which they already are. And we then must just circle around and animate the environment in which these terms are discovered or utilized. And I think that this is important because it connects this kind of philosophical realm, which many of those thinkers try to destroy or disintegrate. They bring it in convergence to the daily life or the daily use of the term. And in that way, they expand the possibilities of our thoughtful or mindful engagement with the world. I chose these three examples because they first represent, in Heidegger, this is like a monolithic philosophy, and everybody deals with Dasein. With the Bohr, situation is radically different. Nobody takes him seriously and just think like, yeah, this is like this crazy French anarchist. And with the Japanese tradition, we have already this environment laid out, because the disposition of their language is just radically different, that everything already exists on that level. And then Kitaro Nishida just needed some kind of input from the Western tradition to make this happen. So yeah, I consider them in parts of this geometric terminology, or maybe mathematical, in this term of being it infinitesimally small, conjuring place of this, yeah, the three philosophies. It could be certainly applied maybe to some others.
Okay. Colleague Welfer, next question.
So thank you for your presentation, also because you take up seriously Debord. And I really agree that Debord is not, of course, a crazy French anarchist, a great philosopher, especially in the commentaries that he wrote after the Société du Spectacle. No? The commentaries are really, in the 80s, are really, really good. The notion of spettacolo integrato, integral spectacle, this is very, very useful for our times. But my question is more about Heidegger. And when we say Heidegger, we know that every time we bite our tongue, because it's impossible to say Heidegger. It's more than 50 years of activity, 102 or 4, I don't remember very well, volumes of the Gesamtausgabe. I mean, it's a crazy word, okay? So I would appreciate much more delimitation when you time delimitation when you speak about vernacularism. But I also would like to flag, I don't know what do you think about it. Would also like to flag that it's wonderful. I think I found it extraordinary that the most important words in Heidegger thinking that ignite Heidegger thinking, not where Heidegger thinking ends, but that ignite Heidegger thinking are the most are the simplest word ever, like Ding, like Welt, like I don't, even Dasein, okay, like I don't know, Gestell is a very simple word, okay. I find it extraordinary, and I mean overall, Sein, to be. There is no vernacularism in that. I don't know how do you think about it, but this simple concept, these simple notions that we lost completely are the most important in Heidegger thinking. Being, Welt, word, thing. What do you think about it? Thank you.
Thank you. Yeah, I agree. I'm glad to hear that you also like Debord and his commentaries on the Society of the Spectacle. On an important note, I mean, like Heidegger and Debord also meet in the thought of George Agamben, who was a correspondent of Debord for some time in the 80s. But just to circle back to your question, yeah, Heidegger's terms are radically simple, and I find the central terms are I just wanted to stress the overwhelming importance of us grasping them as such, because in philosophy, especially in numerous translations and the way people here tend to read Heidegger, which is through English translations or any language they read, these things are often missed out or looked over because you have to utilize very large terminological pool in English language to convey something as simple but philosophically stimulating as it is expressed in Heidegger. I don't remember if there was something more I should have.
No, thank you very much. Just to stress why vernacularism, when the most important words are the simplest one, you know, being, Welt, denken,